A few months ago, I made a video about the first 3 Devil May Cry games after I bought all of them and binge played them in 1 week like healthy people do. In doing so, I discovered that I love Devil May Cry. Except for the second one, which is really boring and we can all just pretend it doesn't exist. But anyway, I love the first and third games. I said in that video that DMC is basically the over-the-top action parts of a Resident Evil game cranked up to 11 and given its own franchise, which is actually kind of what happened. Dante is the perfect action game protagonist with a cocky attitude he can always back up by kicking ass. Plus, he is always fun to play as with tight controls and awesome attacks and weapons. Throw in some pretty good story threads involving him and his heritage plus evil twin brother, and you've got a great series on your hands. If you haven't already seen that video, make sure to check it out before finishing this one. I'll wait. Did you watch it and like it? Alright, good, let's continue. This video is going to be a follow-up to that video where this time around I'll be covering the next 2 games in the series, Devil May Cry 4 and DMC Devil May Cry, a reboot of the franchise. So grab your flashy red trench coat, your twin guns, and let's get right into it with Devil May Cry 4. There's 2 Dantes now basically. Let me just say right at the beginning that I do like Devil May Cry 4 overall. It still controls great and the combat is as satisfying as ever. Hell, it's even more varied than ever before in some respects, which I'll get to later. I want to make that clear because I do have some criticism for the game despite how much I do like it. DMC4 almost feels like the series is going through growing pains in a way. The series just hit what some consider to be its peak with DMC3, a game often considered to be one of the best action games of all time. It had fantastic gameplay coupled with a surprisingly compelling and personal story for Dante. Heights like that are hard to follow up, and overall, DMC4 delivers, albeit with a few hiccups along the way. The biggest addition to DMC4 is the brand new protagonist Nero. Games introducing new characters in this way can always be a bit of a gamble. Often the game tells you that you like the character and how cool they are in hopes that you just end up liking them because they pretty much tell you to. Luckily, that's not really the case here. Nero is great, and he stands out because he is just a good character. I really like him. A big part of that does come from DMC5, but we'll get to that someday. Nero is in no way a replacement for Dante. Dante is still a main player. He's just sidelined a bit in the story so that Nero can take center stage and we can be properly introduced to him. In fact, let's start with the story in general. The game opens with Nero running late to a church sermon for this cult he's a part of. Doesn't sound great, but just give me a second. On his way there, he mows through some punk-ass demons with literally one arm tied up. He makes it to the sermon and sits next to his girlfriend Kyrie, just in time for Dante to burst through the ceiling and shoot the high priest in the head, seemingly killing him. I should probably mention that this cult is called the Order of the Sword and they worship Sparta as a god. For those of you who need a refresher, Sparta is Dante's demon father, who's famous for protecting the world from all the other meaner demons. Anyway, Nero doesn't take kindly to Dante's blatant murder, and the two engage in fisticuffs. Gameplay wise, this isn't that interesting of a fight since it mainly acts as the tutorial for the game. Naturally, Nero isn't much of a challenge for Dante, so he just kinda leaves. Just as Dante escapes, the town that is home to the Order starts to be invaded by demons. Nero is sent after Dante by Kyrie's brother Credo, a member of the Holy Knights, who is basically chief of security for the Order. Nero takes off after Dante, and that's where the game begins properly. While on Dante's trail, you encounter bosses and puzzles and all the typical DMC fanfare, and overall it's as good as ever. Nero is similar in playtype to Dante, but different enough to be unique. His sword, the Red Queen for instance, has the ability to basically rev up like a motorcycle, because of course it does, and this allows for extra damage depending on how much revving up you do. He also has his Devilbringer ability, which means one of his arms is literally a demon arm and can be used to bring enemies closer to you and deliver devastating blows. The Devilbringer specifically makes Nero a lot easier to play as than Dante, especially during boss fights. He also has a single gun called the Blue Rose as opposed to the dual guns Dante carries. Design wise, I find Nero to be very uninspired in this game. I feel like they made him look a little too close to Dante with the long hair and the whole outfit he's got going on. This is fixed in DMC5, but it's also not terrible here. I just personally don't vibe with it. Back to the story, on his journey to find Dante, Nero discovers that Agnes, a sniveling nerd with an obsession with turning people into demons, has been running tests on people using the Amato, the sword that once belonged to Dante's evil twin brother Virgil. Turns out the sword has a bit of connection with Nero. Who could have possibly seen that coming? And this actually unlocks his version of the Devil Trigger ability. The difference here being that it mostly powers up his Devilbringer ability. He continues on his journey and realizes that Dante isn't really the bad guy, and the Order of the Sword has actually been up to some shady stuff. They've been turning people into quote-unquote angels using Agnes's research. One of those people even being Credo, who turns on the order when they kidnap Kyrie. Obviously, kidnapping his sweetheart wasn't going to go over well with Nero, so now he has a new mission: rescue Kyrie. Now this is where the story starts to fall apart for me. The main villain is the high priest Dante murders in the beginning. He obviously didn't actually die. His name is Sanctus, and his whole plan is just super uninteresting and kind of nonsensical. He basically builds this giant creature he calls the Savior and unleashes the demons on Fortuna, with the idea being he uses the Savior to stop the demons in the name of Sparta and restore people's faith in him. It's just so whatever. It's lame and basically makes no sense, and he just sucks as an antagonist. Oh no, look out, it's some old guy. Anywho, to make his dumb Savior thing work, he needs a descendant of Sparta and the Yamada to power it. So he captures Nero and traps him within the Savior, and all hope is lost. Yeah, not really. This is when you finally get to play as Dante. With Nero MIA and the Savior on the rampage, Dante takes over and goes after it. Also, Trish is there, but she doesn't really do anything, but just kind of exists, so yeah. Anyway, Dante plays pretty much the same as he did in DMC3, just a bit smoother. Plus now you can swap between his 4 fighting styles seamlessly during combat, which is just Now, one of the biggest criticisms I've seen for this game is there is a lot of backtracking, and unfortunately that is completely true. All of Dante's missions are him traveling back the way you've already come as Nero. It's just really tedious and means you just revisit the already not that interesting locations you did already as Nero, which honestly kind of sucks, especially since you're doing all this as the main man Dante. There is one cool thing that comes from this, and that is that you get to redo the boss fights Nero did, but you get to watch Dante kick their asses way more thoroughly. I love this because it really demonstrates the power difference between the two. Nero may be good, but Dante is better. Eventually, Dante catches up with the Savior and thus begins probably the worst boss fight in the whole series, possibly even counting DMC2. I hated the Savior fight so very much. It was just a slog to get through and lacks any real tension. After beating it, you free Nero and he gets to kick Sanctus's ass, which is an alright boss fight, but not nearly as good an epic final showdown as we got in DMC3. Obviously that's going to be hard to live up to, but both final fights for both characters in this game just kind of suck. Regardless, the day is saved and Dante gives Nero his blessing by letting him hold on to Yamato and keep it safe. The two leave things amicably, and the credits roll while you slaughter demons. The story is pretty alright up until the end where, like I said, it just kind of falls apart. It is saved by the introduction of Nero and his dynamic with Dante. It's pretty obvious from the beginning that they are related, and it's pretty obvious how, but we'll save that for the next video. Outside of just playing the story, there's a lot to do. This is mostly because the game has the most playable characters in any Devil May Cry game. In the special edition of this game, you can play as Dante, Nero, Lady, making her first playable appearance, Trish, and Virgil, naturally. You can even play through the story with all of these bonus characters if you want. You don't really get anything from it except for some extra cutscenes at the beginning and end, but still, it's cool. Plus, there are some extra challenging difficulties you can try out if you hate yourself. The Bloody Palace makes its grand turn, and it's as good as ever. All in all, there's a lot to do in this game, and considering how cheap it is these days, I fully recommend it. It's not my overall favorite in the series, but I do love how many different characters you can play as. It does have its faults, mostly in the story and the amount of backtracking, but it gets more right than it does wrong. The same can't be said for the next game I want to talk about, DMC Devil May Cry. I don't like this game. Honestly, I was hoping I would play it and say the opposite. I think technically it's the first DMC game I played years and years and years ago on my PS3, and I remember liking it at the time. I never got more than 3 missions in, but still. Obviously at the time I didn't even realize it was a reboot of a classic series, and revisiting it with that information, well, it changes things. I don't like this game. To clarify, it's an alright game, but it's a pretty bad Devil May Cry game. They change a whole bunch of things about the story, and none of it really works for me. Dante gets a redesign where he looks like he doesn't shower and you'd probably get some disease just from touching him. They introduce boring side characters you're supposed to care about, but they're so typical it's hard to. And they made Virgil look like a neckbeard. It's all pretty bad. Before we get into that, let's talk about some of the good from this game. Gameplay wise, it's actually pretty great. A lot of classic DMC elements are carried over, like the style system, and a bunch of Dante's movesets are directly taken from older games. The big difference is in how weapons are used and swapped during gameplay. In DMC4, you could swap between weapons with a simple press of the button, and here you can do the same thing, only differently. By holding down either trigger button, you can switch between angel and demon weapons on the fly. Throughout the story, you unlock multiple angel and demon weapons that you can equip by hitting the D-pad to swap between. There's a big demon fist for heavy damage attacks, and an angel scythe for quick ranged attacks. attacks, and you can control which one you're using at any given moment by holding down the left trigger for angel stuff and the right trigger for demon stuff. It takes a little getting used to, but once you do, the variety of attacks you can change between with relative ease leads to some insane combos. It's a pretty great combat system all in all, and by far the highlight of the game. The only problem with it is the enemies you'll be using against. They're not very good. They're more annoying than anything and are by far the worst bunch of demons in the Devil May Cry game. Other than 2, of course. The idea of having to use specific weapon types to deal with specific enemies is cool in theory, but none of the enemies really gel well with each other. They're also just really boring to look at, which is a shame because DMC enemies usually have some pretty cool designs. This applies to the bosses too. Aside from one boss that's like a demon news program, all the bosses are just kinda gross, especially the succubus. Let's get into the story now, I guess. I don't like it. I think my biggest complaint about the story of this game is that it just feels like it's trying too hard to be edgy. It just ends up feeling like a middle schooler going through an emo phase that says f all the time to seem cool. Like seriously, the amount of gratuitous swearing in this game is kind of absurd, and that's coming from a guy who has a hard time not swearing himself. I'm going to pull off your head based on your language. Just like chill out a bit. The whole game just feels like it's trying too hard, and maybe it wouldn't feel that way if it hadn't slapped the Devil May Cry name onto it. If this game was its own original IP, I think I would have a much more positive opinion of it. The problem is they made it a reboot of a beloved series and made something completely new that just uses names and elements we'd recognize. Not to mention the fact that it invites a direct comparison to the rest of the Devil May Cry games. If it was its own thing, it would still probably be compared to Devil May Cry, but it wouldn't matter as much because at least it had its own identity. By making it a DMC game, it automatically puts it up against the rest of the series. There is a legacy and history behind it that wouldn't have been a problem otherwise. It should have just been its own thing. Probably would have been received better too. Okay, let's actually get into the story this time. Overall, it's just kind of nothing. They basically YA'd the whole thing to make it appeal more to a younger demographic, and because of this, the story is pretty generic. Dante and Virgil are still the sons of Sparta, but their mother is an angel this time around, like a literal angel. This plays into the gameplay by letting Dante use angel and demon weapons for different effects, which I mentioned earlier. In theory, it's a cool concept, but to me, it just seems less interesting than making them half human, at least with these two characters specifically. It robs them of an important connection to humanity that I think is somewhat necessary for the characters, especially Dante. Mundus this time around basically rules over humankind by controlling everything like the press, the politicians, the police, but he was already a nothing character in the first game, so this change might actually be an improvement, or at least it would be if he wasn't just a different kind of generic bad guy than he was before. So much of his dialogue is, ooh, look how evil I am, wahahaha, and it just doesn't really add anything. Plus the overall obnoxious edginess that permeates this game might be most noticeable with him. He's just trying too hard. The story starts with Dante meeting this girl named Sam. Wait, was it Sam? Hold on, I need to check because I can legitimately never remember her name. Oh, her name is Kat. Where the hell did I get Sam? Anyway, Sam warns him of a demon bounty hunter who's after him, who pulls him into limbo. All the fighting in this game has to be done in limbo for some reason. Naturally, Dante beats the demon, and Kat takes him to the leader of the human resistance, and it's, drumroll please, Virgil! That's right, he's totally good this time. He likes humans. He's not a power-hungry lunatic. Sure hope that doesn't get completely 180'd later in the game. The majority of the game are missions to sabotage Mundus' empire. Eventually, it's time to fight Mundus himself, so they do that. The brothers have to use the power of sibling love to kill him, and they do. Dante does almost all of the work, but still, the day is saved. I mean, besides all the demons now loose in the world that will probably kill thousands of people, and the entire city they destroyed in their fight with Mundus, but other than that, totally saved the day. But it's not quite over yet, because Virgil thinks him and Dante should rule over humanity. For some reason. Wow, what a surprise. Virgil is a dick, who would have guessed? I've seen some people say that this twist is completely out of left field, and I don't fully agree with that. The game does put some clues in the story to show that Virgil might not be as altruistic as he claims to be. He was totally fine leaving Kat to die at the hands of Mundus after she's captured, and also almost gets her killed during her rescue. They save her by kidnapping Mundus' gross baby mama and doing a trade-off which Virgil ruins by killing her and her unborn demon child during the actual trade-off, leading Kat to almost be gunned down by these guys who don't shoot at her until Dante's in front of her, luckily for her. Could have been telegraphed much more, but I don't think it was completely out of nowhere that this version of Virgil also sucks. My big problem with this reveal is the fact that Virgil is the final boss of this game, and the main reason I think that's dumb is simple. This version of Virgil would stand exactly 0% chance against Dante. Dante spends the whole game getting stronger and finding new weapons and improving, while Virgil spends the whole game not fighting anyone at all. He's the brains of the operation, not the brawn, and you will never convince me that this version of Virgil stood any chance against this version of Dante. This should have been like a 5-second fight. It's also annoying that they felt the need to shoehorn in a fight DMC3 already nailed and then do it worse. Whack. It's whack. There is a DLC story that lets you play as Virgil, because that's a requirement for all DMC games at this point, reboot or otherwise, but I'm not gonna play it. I just don't really want to. I know I've been harping on this game pretty hard, but I really don't think it's all that bad. My biggest problem is they tried to make this a Devil May Cry game when it just isn't. If it was completely original, then a lot of my issues with it would just disappear. At that point, it doesn't have anything to live up to or resemble. The characters wouldn't feel like cheap knockoffs because they would be their own thing with original stories. Ninja Theory, the people that developed this game, are clearly talented and have gone on to make some fantastic games, and this could have been something if they were given the freedom to make something new. All this isn't helped by the fact that the next actual Devil May Cry game we got was damn near perfect. Devil May Cry 5 is my favorite in the series, which we'll get into next time, and honestly it makes this look even more pointless. They could clearly still knock it out of the park with actual Devil May Cry games, so why try this at all? No one was asking for this. It's not like DMC4 was universally panned. People still really like that game. From the beginning, this was a reboot that simply didn't need to exist. If you've never played a Devil May Cry game before, check this one out, because you'll probably like it. At least until you play an actual Devil May Cry game. Alright, well, I've ranted on about this long enough. If you liked the video, don't forget to leave a like and a subscribe if you aren't already. If you've played these games, let me know your thoughts on them in the comments below. I love reading and responding to comments, and I appreciate any and all feedback. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in whatever I do next.